So we're on page Dalid. On the right column, it's 4 paragraphs before the end of the page. Harovea ve'hanirva, amuksa v'nevad, ha'esnan ha'mechir, v'chein v'chusizman, memirim bahen ve'alehem. And we've discussed the case of a balas mum, and we said that either if the behemas kodesh is a balas mum, or if the behemas chulin is a balas mum, in either case, the tmura is a valid maisa tmura. And now we're going beyond the cases of balas mum to other cases of psulei hamukdosh, psulei karbonos, which include the following list. And in all cases, if either the behemas kodesh has that psul or the behemas chulin has that psul, there is a maisa tmura. And what are those psulim? Rovea, nirva, muktzah, v'nevad, esnan umechir kelev, and mechus zman. What are these cases entail? So we know about Rovea and Nirva, and they are psulei mikdashim. And Nevad is an animal that was worshipped for avodah zarah. And we have Esnan, which was an animal that was designated as payment to a harlot, a zona. Mechir kelev is a case where you used the animal to purchase or pay for a nirva. Mechus zman is an animal that hasn't yet reached its, let's say, its 8th day. And in all these cases, like the case of balas mum, there is a maisa tmura. And what we suggest was that there's still a vestige of kedushas mizbeach, and therefore the maisa is a maisa tmura. What does he have here in Ches? That I have to turn the page to the other side, right? Kodshim, Yud Gimel, it's based on a Mishnah Shkolim, Ram in Tmura, and the Ram writes V'chein kol kayotze ben, so he doesn't even give us the whole list of Kodshim. And the Mechaskina points out that when the Ram says V'chein kol kayotze ben, he means this entire list. That's what he's. Hifrish nekeva lepischo ulashama. Now, for a korban pesach or a korban osham, you need a zachar, and he was mafresh in a nekeva. So you and I would say, well, there was never even a vestige of kedusha. It doesn't even have a semblance of kedusha, and you can't do a maisa tmura with something that doesn't have any and never even had a status of hekesh. Nevertheless, nechluku tanoim, we have a machlokes tanoim. It says here on the bottom, it's a Gemara Tmura Daf Yutesa Midbeis. Im chalbem kedusha saguf the osim Tmura, o ein b'hem el kedushas davim veinum osim Tmura. I mean, I understand very well the second opinion that there's no kedushas haguf, there's only kedushas damim, and you can't talk about a vestige of kedushas haguf because it was never sanctified for the mizbeach. You can't bring a pesach as an akeva. You can't bring a korban osham as an akeva. So the only possible answer to this question is that the psul here, or the ma'akev, impediment, so to speak, in being mafresh ein akeva as either a pesach or an osham is external to the animal itself. What do I mean external? The animal is a female, not a male. What I mean to say is that when the Torah says you can't bring a female, you basically have the species of the animal. It's a lamb. Because the Torah says you can't bring it on the Mizbeach. It's a din in the same carbon, or shall we say in the mitzvah sakarban. But it's not really in the goof of the behema because it does belong to the right species. It does have its shame seh. Let's say the Torah says bring a seh for a carbon pesach, and seh really includes even the females of that species. But the Torah says that you're not makayim the mitzvah of pesach if you didn't bring a zoch. The other mandiyama makes more sense. We'd have to see the sugya inside. If rich nekeva lo lost. Now, until now, we discussed Pesach and Oshim. Now we're moving over to a carbon ola, which also requires a zoch. Now let's go according to the first opinion, the one that we felt was the intuitive opinion, that if you are mafresh in a keva for a Pesach or an Osham, it's eno osa tmura. So you can't have a maisa tmura on something that was completely excluded from Mizbeach from the get-go. Is what would that Mandiyomer say in the case of an Ola? In other words, if you hold that even in Pesach and Osham, there is a Maisa Tmura in the case of an Akeva, Hifrish Nekeva, then how much more so in the case of an Ola? But if you hold that in the cases of Pesach and Osham and Akeva does not lend itself to a Maisa Tmura, would that Shita concede that at least in the case of an Ola, where is Mafresh and Akeva for an Ola, that would be subject and lend itself to a Maisa Tmura? Nechluku Tanoimim Sovertain, Gam ben Akevas Ola, Oshabazel Divrei Akol Osa Tmura. That certainly in the case of an Ola, we would not say that the Ola from the get-go, if it was an Akeva, is completely excluded from Mizbeach, and therefore it has no vestige of Kedushas Mizbeach, or Kedushas Guf as we called it. And the Gemara goes on and says that Ola is different than the paradigm cases of Pesach and Osham. Ola in general is a much more all-inclusive carbon. Right? You could bring an Ola binidava. You can't bring an Osham binidava. You could bring an Ola any day of the year. I mean, I'm not sure about Yom Tov, but any day of the year that's Chol. Whereas Pesach can only be brought on the 14th of Nisan. So Ola, which is both a carbon Yachid, it could be a carbon Sibur. Ola is like this all-inclusive kind of carbon. So even though the Torah says that when you obligated yourself to bring an Ola, what you had in mind is an Ola of Zachar, not Nekeva, but nevertheless, it does have, in the case of a Nekeva, some sort of Kedusha or vestige, I don't know what you want to call it, a reach of a Kedushas Mizbeach. And Lalachi says, Kulam Osim. Even in the cases of Pesach and Osham, we're going to paskin that there is a Maisa Tmura on an Akeva. Bivlados, be'ubrin, ube'evarin. So we have a behemoth's hegdish, and it gives birth to a vlad. Vlados. So this is a category called Vlados Kodshim, which means that its Kedusha is sort of inherited. It wasn't that after the Vlad was born to a Bemis Hegdesh, he was Magdish the Vlad after he came into the world. He wasn't Magdish the Vlad, but it gets a Kedusha with certain Isurim that it inherits from its mother. The mother was a Behemas Kodshim. Ubrin, which means it hasn't even been born yet, and a Varim means he did a Maisa Tvura on the limbs of a Behemas Kodshim. And on these three cases, we have Machlokes Tanoim as to whether Osim Tvura or Ein Osim Tvura. Because again, in all these cases of Lodos, Ubrin, and Evarim, the status of Kedusha is a secondary status. It's not a Kedusha L'mizbeach. L'alacha eino osim t'mura. It does not have a Kedusha L'mizbeach. Now, on the left column, I think it says Echad B'meah, but I have to go back to the previous page. No, that's not. Ein uber shel behemas kodshim osa t'mura. I don't know why he repeats himself. Af kedushas alon kodshim lekadosh b'fnei atzmo. But he doesn't really explain this in great detail. I wouldn't give him an A plus in pedagogy here, but I guess the Gemara there that he's referring to in Torah vacillates about the sanctity of Vlad Kodshim. Whatever vestige of sanctity it has, is it only because it's attached to its mother, or now that it's born and it's an independent, viable being on its own, it has its own inherent Kedusha, but whatever Kedusha it has, it's not Kedusha's Mizbeach, it's a Guf, and therefore, Eina Osim T'mura. Now, I have a suspicion here, this is just an intuition on my part, that what he is referring to here is a concept, I don't know if you're familiar with this, called Uber Yerech Imo. Have you heard that? And I think what he's saying is that one could have argued that Uber Yerech Imo, and therefore the same status that the mother has, the Uber has, until it's born. So when it's a Vlad of Kodshim, and it's a viable being on its own, it stands on its own 2 feet, independent of its mother, then it has a history of a very weak, limited, diluted kind of Kedusha. It's not Limizbeach, and you can't use it for T'mura. But in the case of an Ubar, if I were to activate the principle of Uber Yerech Imo, I might have assumed that just like you could be Meimer, you could do a Maisa T'mura with Imo, so the same Kedusha Guf applies to the Ubar. But he says, Ein Ubar shel behemas kodshim osa T'mura. Af, he says in the footnote, in Kedushasa lo midin Vlad Kodshim el kodesh b'fnei atzmo. Now that footnote makes a lot of sense. You could have argued that the Ubar, even in its mother's womb, not yet born, has the status of Vlad Kodshim, meaning it's an independent entity. And as such, it doesn't gain any status of Kedushas Mizbeach. because we said Vlad Kodshim does not have the status of Kedusha Mizbeach and Enos and Tmura. But in the case of Ubar, forget about the Ubar as a separate entity, no different than Vlad Kodshim. We could have argued logically that as an Uber Yerech Imo, it has the Kedusha of its mother, and therefore you could be Meimer on the Uber. But he says, no, Ein Uber shall Bemis Kodshim also Tmura. Because I guess it's only a Yerech Imo. No, it's not an essential part of the mother. It doesn't have its own independent status, but yet it's not part of the mother. It's sort of like floating in mid-space, in mid-air between the two. It's not yet a Vlad Kodshim, and therefore we might think as part of the mother, it does have the status of Kedushas Mizbeach for Tmura purposes, but the answer is no. It's not part of the mother. It's separate from the mother. It's like an additional aver to the mother. V'chein ein eivarim shel bemis kodshim osa tmura. V'chein ein mamirin al ubar shel bemis chulin. So the uber is nowhere. You know what I'm saying? It's like floating in space. If we gave it the status of its own entity, then it would be like a Vlad of Bemis Chulin. In the case of an Ubar, a fetus inside of Bemis Chulin, it would be like the Vlad of Bemis Chulin, which of course is subject to Tmura. But we're saying no, it's not a separate entity because it's not yet born. On the other hand, it's not an aver, it's not a leg or an organ of the behemoth itself, where you could make a tmura on any organ of the animal. No, it's just a separate entity unto itself. Okay. Now he just finished saying that ein memirin al ubar shel behemas chulin. Why? Because the ubar, even though it's like an aver of its mother, but nevertheless it's a separate entity. And since it's not yet born, it's not subject to the hegdesh of Tmura. But what about the aver of a behemoth chulin? Nechliku tanoim memirim al aver shel behemoth chulin. Notice you have a behemoth hegdesh, and you turn to an aver of the behemoth chulin, and you say, Harei zu tachazu. And on that, we're going to have a machlokas tanoim. Which again, I would logically analyze this in terms of Yerech Imo. That maybe we should view the aver as part of its mother, and therefore it should be subject to Tmura. Or do we say no? It's only an aver. It's not really an essential part of the mother. I wonder if it depends on which aver it was. The aver shel chulin, yesh lomar pashta kula bekule, magdish aver echad shel behemoth chulin b'kedusha rishona. So let's say you have an animal, chulin, and you magdish the thigh of the chulin, then the entire animal becomes kadosh. But if you're trying to transpose, or we called it clone, the kedusha from one animal onto the yerech of a behemoth chulin, then according to one Mandi Omar, it's not going to be valid. It's not going to be a ma'aseh tmura. We're not going to apply the principle of pashta kula kedusha b'kula. So I think when he says here, the reading here is a little bit ambiguous. I'm going to read it like this. Nechleku tanoim according to one Tana, you could be Meimir onto the Aver of Behemoth Chulin. Why? Because Aver Shel Chulin Yesh Lomar, we're going to say with regard to an Aver of Behemoth Chulin exactly what we would say regarding being Magdish Mitchila, an entire, directly being Makadish a Behemoth Chulin, but not a Behemoth Chulin, an Aver of Behemoth Chulin, and that's the principle of Pashta Kedusha Bakula. But with Magdish Aver Echad Shel Behemoth Chulin, Kedusha Rishona. You follow what I'm saying? That this sentence that starts with the words Shebe Aver Shel Chulin is an answer to the question why the Aver of Behemoth Chulin is subject to a Maisa Tmura. And the answer is because we're going to apply the principle of Pashta Kula Kedusha Bakula. Does anybody remember that sugya of Pashta Kedusha Bakula? The case was that instead of a man saying to a woman, Hareat Mekudeshesli, etc., he says to her, Chetziach Mekudeshesli. I want to marry only half of you, leaving the other half for someone else to marry. So the two men can marry the same woman. You'll marry half, and I'll marry the other half. I don't know which half you're going to divide it, but in any event. And the Gemara compares it Kodshim in a case where a man was magdish half of the animal. And the law is that the entire animal becomes Kodesh. That's called Pashta Kedusha Bakula. And the Gemara thinks that Kedushin is also Miloshin Hekdesh. And now when he marries half of a woman, the Kedushin spreads to encompass the entire woman. That's Gemara Kedushin, whatever daf it is. Dalid, daf hey, it's there at the very beginning of Kedushin. The only one who's learning Kedushin, they're probably hovering over that sugi. So I think when he says, Shebe'ever shel chulin yesh lomar pashta kedusha b'kula kemo v'magdish evrechem v'behemas chulin, etc., he's explaining that Tana who holds that there is a Maisa Torah on an Aver of Behemas Chulin. But Lalachi says we pass like the other Tana that ain memirin al every chulin, which means that although you can be magdish an aver of a behemoth chulin, and then the kedusha spreads throughout the whole animal, you cannot be memer from a behemoth kodshim onto an aver of a behemoth chulin, because tmura is not the same as being magdish something. And in the case of Tmur, you have to begin, according to this Madhyama, with an animal, a total full animal, which lends itself, as is, to a Maisa Kiddush of Tmura. So, when you Magdish an animal, there are two categories of being Magdish an animal. One is to be Magdish an animal Barishona, which he calls Kedusha Rishona. I look at the animal and I Magdish it. And here I have a great deal of flexibility, as we'll soon see. Or I can be Magdish an animal through Tmura, and that's a different mechanism. It's not identical with being Magdish the animal directly. In the case of being Magdish the animal directly, we have a certain flexibility that allows your Maisa Kiddush, your Akdosha, to be on part of the animal, and it is a valid Akdosha because it spreads throughout the entire animal. But in the case of Tmura, that's already a fallback, a secondary kind of Kiddush, of Hakdosha, and therefore the conditions that have to be met are that much greater than in a Maisa Hakdosha. So, for example, you're going to need a Maisa Hakdosha on the entire animal, but not on its Aver. So if you say, Hare Zu Tmura Zu, but you're saying Hare Aver Shel Behemas Tmura Zu, then you cannot effectuate a kiddush through tmura on an aver of an animal. And we do not apply the principle of pashta. See, pashta kedusha b'kula means that once I can be magdish the aver, now it spreads, the hegdesh spreads and encompasses the whole animal. But at stage one, I was magdish part of the animal. Not so in the case of Tmura. Tmura means that this is replacing this. And we call it B replacing A, but B can only replace A if B as a whole, from the get-go, could be subject to that Akdosha of a Maisa Tmura. That's how we pass. But fascinating is that there's another opinion in the Tanoim, according to which Behemas Chulin is subject to a Maisa Tmura in Aver, just like a Behema Chulin is subject to being Magdish in the Aver. And we apply the principle of Pashta Kedusha. I would suggest that maybe the issue really revolves around the mechanism of Pashta Kula Kedusha Bekula. Is it in one fell swoop or is it in two segments? Meaning one fell swoop means that we reinterpret his Hakadasha as if he was Magdish the entire animal. Or do we say no, he was only Magdish part of the animal, but once part of the animal becomes Hegdesh, then in a certain sense it is what's the word I'm looking for? It's contagious, meaning it spreads throughout the entire animal. If it's a reinterpretation of the Hakadosh, then it should work even in Tmura. But if it's a two-stage process, then we can understand very well why, in the case of Tmura, it's excluded. Higdish Aver shel Behemas Chulin upashta bekula yachal lahamir ba. Honestly, I don't know what the chiddush is. This is very intuitive. He was magdish the aver of behemas chulin. Now we apply the principle of pashta kula kedusha bekula, and the entire animal is kodesh. Now we can use that animal no less than any animal that he was magdish for the mizbeach as a jump-off point, as being the A from which he clones onto B in a ma'aseh tmura. Not sure why you need a chiddush. Don't know. Is it possible that when you apply, oh, wait a minute, you know what I'm thinking? Everything okay?
Yeah, just
take care of it. Batzlach. I think the Gemara is vacillating here about how Tmura works, how a Maisa Tmura works. Let me offer two possibilities about how a Maisa Tmura works. One is that I take the original Hakadasha of animal A, and through Tmura, through the Maisa Tmura, I impose on animal B the same identical Maisa Hakadasha. The other way of learning it is that Tmura comes from the Kedusha of animal A, not from the Maisa HaKadosh, but from the Chalos Kedusha in the animal itself. If it's from the Chalos Kedusha, that I clone that Kedusha onto the second animal, Be'emaskulin, then there's no difference whether the first animal was Kadosh Midin, complete Kedusha Richona, or it was through the mechanism of Pashta Kedusha Vikula when it was Magnich only in Aver. But if, on the other hand, I'm not transposing the Kedusha from animal A onto animal B, but I'm transposing the Maisa HaKadosha, as if I'm repeating the Maisa HaKadosha through the Maisa Tmura, then the original Maisa HaKadosha would not work through the mechanism of Tmura, because we paskin Ema Mirim al Evare Chul. B'das hasover she'ema Mirim al Evare Chulin, which we said we accept that halacha. Echleku the ofen shehemir al chetzia shel behemas chulin. In other words, does chetzia have the same identical status as evarim? Im nechsheves tmura zu kitmuras evarim, the ein mamirim ba utato ola. So why would chetzia be different than evarim? In the bottom he says chetzio ke evarim. ach ke'ivarim shaneshama tluya b'hem. Or beis chetzia l'divrei hakol eino ke'ivarim. And I think when he says eino ke'ivarim, it means that it is subject to a valid ma'aseh t'mura. The first side was to say that chetzia ke'ivarim means that's what I indicated before. I was wondering which organs of the animal are we dealing. But he says here that the Mari Kurkus in the Rambam interprets that Etzike Varm the aim Mirimba. So it means that according to the Rambam, the way the Mari Kurkus understands the Rambam, Chetzia is worse than a Varm. Because at least in the case of a Varim, we have a principle, a mechanism called Pashta Kedusha V'Kula. But in the case of Chetzia, he's only being Magdich half the animal. It means that somebody else can come along and be Magdish the other half of the animal. They become Shutfim in a Behemoth Kodesh. So the Chetzia does not have the advantage of a Varim. Because we said in the case of a Varim, there was one man, the Yomu says that there is a Maisa Tvur on a Varim Chal Behemoth Kulin, because of Pashta Kedusha V'Kula, but in Chetzia, apparently, according to the Mari Korkus, we don't have that luxury of Pashta Kedusha V'Kula. He was Magdish half the animal. That's it. But Tosfos, on the other hand, seems to be open to the idea that Chetzia is like a Varim, in the sense of a Varim Shanashama Tliyabed, which means that Tosfos is willing to accept the possibility, at least, that Chetzia has the din of Pashta Kula Kedusha B'Kula, and therefore, according to that man Yomer, that you can do a Ma'aseh Tmura on a Varim, and it's valid, then you can do a Ma'aseh Tmura on Chetzia, because Chetzia is like a Varim plus. It's even better than a Varim. It's upgraded because it's a Varim Shanashama Tluya B'Hem. There's no doubt that Chetzia, that half the animal, would certainly include, by definition, vital organs for the life of the animal. And Kolshke, that we should apply the principle of Tmura if we're willing to apply it in the case of Varim, how much more so in the case of Chetzia. And the other side is to say, no, the Chetzia is not a Varim. He's not saying, a Varim of half the animal should be Hegdish. He's talking about Chetzia. And as we said before, Tmura is not like a Maisa Hakdasha directly. And there's certain conditions that have to be met that normally would not have to be met. But because it's a Maisa Tmura, which is a secondary kind of Maisa Hakdasha, Chetzia would not be included in the Maisa Hakdasha of Tmura. Now, just one more line before we end. Maybe two more lines. He says, Chosva Tosis She'im Hemir Chetzia Shal Behemoth Kodesh. So now we're talking about the reverse case. Not that he's being meimer on chetzim of behemas kulin, but he's being meimer from a behemas kodshim, but only chetzim. Ein zeh kitmuras eivarim. I think he means that Eivarim are separate, independent parts, so they can't be used for a Ma'aseh Tmura. But Chetzia means that every part of that Chetzia is endowed with Hegdech Kedushas Mizbeach, and therefore can be a jump-off point for Ma'aseh Tmura. And then he quotes the Mari Kurkus, the Lefi Mashibir B'Shitas Aramam Shechetzi Shel Behemas Kulin Reihi Keivarim is Huadin Chetzi Shel Behemas Kodesh. And finally, the Mosaros Nechleku Tanoim the Ola Haba Min HaMosaros in the Mirim Ba Olo. So Mosaros, if I remember correctly, and if anyone wants to correct me, please do so, means that he was mafresh a carbon for a chova, and then it got lost. He was mafresh a second one to replace the first one. He found the first one, and that first one has the status of Mosaros. So it's not the original carbon, but it has the status of Mosaros. And once again, does it have enough of a status of Behemas Hegdesh in order to serve for a Ma'aseh Tmura? And that, once again, is a Machlokes Tanoim. This is where we're going to stop here on number Dalet, on the left column of page Dalet. It's amazing how many Machlokes Tanoim there are in Tmura. That's pretty shocking. It's like the Torah of Tmura was lost over the centuries, and there are so many different, differences of opinion